Let's go down to Baltimore, Maryland, is where I can only imagine Ron Snyder is today, the author of the book on the Baltimore Stallions. Howdy, Ron. How are you?
How are you guys doing today? Thanks for having me.
You know, we're doing great. I shouldn't assume that you're in Baltimore just because you wrote a book on the Stallions. Where are you at?
I am in Baltimore. Baltimore.
Okay. How are things in Baltimore amid the coronavirus pandemic, if you don't mind me starting there?
No, it's of course that's what everyone's talking about. It's like many of the parts of the country. I mean, schools are shut down. My kids are doing schoolwork right. Restaurants and bars here in Maryland are closed for everything except carry out and delivery. We're pretty much shut down right now and just kind of waiting to see how this plays out and just trying to be safe, doing social distancing, and just listening to what the health experts are telling us to do.
That is exactly what we have here, and I guess it's all over the globe. So, Ron, thank you for that. Now, I got to be honest. Somehow, some way, I saw your initial tweet about your book on the Stallions, and it piqued my interest. As a 20-year CFL guy and a lifelong fan, I knew all about the Stallions, watched them real closely, and had a lot of good friends go through that organization. Jim Popp and Don Matthews, chief among them. What made you want to write this book, and what's it feel like now that it's finally out?
Well, this was a story I've been wanting to tell for about a decade. I'm a journalist in the area for close to 20 years. And, I grew up, I was 16 when the Stallions, Baltimore CFL Colts, CFLers, whatever you want to call them, kind of came through. For those who aren't familiar with Baltimore, we had lost the Colts in 1984. The NFL had teased us a little bit with some expansion. We lost out to Jacksonville and Charlotte. We lost out to some teams possibly moving here. And then, when the CFL expansion happened in the U.S. in the early to mid 90s, Jim Speros came to town and sold us on a winner of a program, and we just really enjoyed it. That was the first team I could have enjoyed growing up as a fan, and the way they kind of caught fire those 2 years, winning the Grey Cup in their last game before kind of ending the U.S. experiment of the CFL.
Well, you guys jump in anytime. Derek, it's a magical time for you, too. I mean,
I find it really, really interesting because when ESPN came out with their 30 for 30s, was it the band played on when the Colts left town? And this is almost kind of like part two to that. I find these documentaries very, very interesting. What's one of the curious stories that takes us into the start of the book and the genesis of the Stallions in Baltimore?
Well, I mean, a lot of it was, kind of that fallout of expansion. Baltimore thought we were going to get Jacksonville. When Jacksonville and Charlotte got the teams, we thought that was going to want to be one of ours. And we were kind of done with the NFL at that point. They had kind of dragged their feet with us and teased us and stole our Colts. And then, football came back. And Don Matthews came into town. Tracy Ham came into town. And they were everywhere. When they came into town, they were at all the schools, all the restaurants. They went out and hooked up with all of the band, even the old Colts band. And then, of course, they connected with, the Colt legends in town. Johnny Unitas, Art Donovan, Bruce Laird, Tom Matty, who owned part of the team, and really kind of they were blue collar players for a blue collar city, and it was football, and it was exciting football, and we embraced them like they were one of our own.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Ron Snyder, but did Johnny Unitas not flip the coin at the first game or one of the games for the Stallions?
He was there. Again, when they were there, I'm trying to remember if he flipped the coin or not, but I know he was there. They introduced all of the players. I mean, they had all of the Hall of Famers there, and that was something that really kind of helped that team take off. Was the fact that those players don't associate with the Indianapolis Colts. They associate with Baltimore, and when a team came here and wanted to embrace themselves for Baltimore, they said, "Hey, these guys are football players, and we love what they're doing here."
The history, Baltimore Stallions, the brief, brilliant history. What got you so interested? I mean, you wouldn't have been that old when this was going down in Baltimore. Why, 25 years later, do you care so much?
Well, I was 16, 17 years old when it happened. And like I said, I was 6 years old when the Colts left. I was 18 when the Ravens arrived. So my whole childhood was out without a professional football team. We had the USFL, but they weren't really part of Baltimore. They practiced in Philly. They played in almost in DC, and they were called Baltimore Stars. But this was the first team that I could embrace, and it was fun football. I mean, and they were good. I mean, and look, they were only there 2 years, but I mean, just look at the impact that they had on the CFL game. I mean, guys like Tracy Ham, Mike Pringle, Alfred Swack Payton. I mean, like you said, Don Matthews, Jim Pop, and it was a story I wanted to tell because I mean, it was like they came in, they captured our hearts. Then the NFL returned, and they were gone. It was almost as quickly as they came, and they never got. I felt the true goodbye that they deserved. I mean, they did everything we asked them to do, and it was and it just at the end of the day, the NFL came back, and there wasn't just room for two professional football teams in Baltimore. And of course, at that point, the CFL experiment in the U.S. Just wasn't going to work. I mean, other than Baltimore and to a lesser degree San Antonio, that didn't work here in the U.S.
Ron, when you think about back to, I know you're 16, 17 years old when Baltimore was in the CFL, but what was the CFL's imprint in Baltimore? What do you remember about the league's imprint? Because it's such a heavy NFL influence all across the United States, but what was the CFL's imprint in that city, while they were having success?
Well, when they were having success, I mean, look, we didn't have an NFL team. We didn't want to embrace Washington, the Redskins, and you got to remember that first year was the year of the MLB strike. So when that strike was going on, the CFLers, as they were called, because they were called the CFL Colts, as you can see in my hat, Baltimore CFL Colts, but the NFL sued, and then they got the injunction. They played that whole first season without a name. And really, it became national stories. I mean, they were leading ESPN, and they were in Sports Illustrated, Washington Post, New York Times, and they were everywhere because at that point they were the only game in town, and they were good. I mean, and that I think that's what made the difference was that it was good football, it was exciting football. We had to get used to some of the Canadian rules, but I mean, we embraced those fairly quickly, and like I said, we had 40,000 fans out to those games for most of that history there.
I'm going to tell you, Ron Snyder, I could talk about this all day. I fear your arms are getting tired. So I have one more question from Colin in Ottawa. He says, Jim Speros should be in the Canadian Football Hall of Fame. Speros proved that Americans can embrace and enjoy the three-down game. I got to ask you about Jim Speros. And guys, I don't know if you recall, but this guy, he was flamboyant. He was like all those great CFL owners of the 90s. And I remember when they lost the Grey Cup, he still got rings made for his team for winning the Southern Division in 94. And then the next year, they actually got the Grey Cup ring. So I guess they just tossed those rings. But what's this guy like, Ron? Is he full of hot air or good dude?
He was a great. He talked to me for a long time. He gave me whatever I needed for this project. He'll tell you that this was the greatest accomplishment of his professional career. On top of that, I mean, they had a reunion here about 5 years ago for the 20th anniversary. And these guys have a connection to each other. And look, and I know the history doesn't necessarily link, but I mean, with the success in Montreal that the Alouettes had for much of their history after arriving in 1996 was because of the success, the foundation that was there in Baltimore that the Stallions had. Jim, again, short history. I mean, he walked the walk and tried to talk the talk, and even 25 years later, you ask him about his time in the CFL and his face will light up. And just like anyone that's associated with that team, I mean, when I reached out to some players, I mean, I had a dozen players who were ready to talk to me within 5 minutes of reaching out to their former PR director, Mike Gathigan. And, and then they said I had to talk to this person and that person and this person and that person. I mean, I interviewed probably close to 50 people for this book, and I think it's a great story. You talked about 30 for 30. I think that this would make a great 30 for 30 in and of itself.
There's no doubt. Ron, I'm looking you up on Twitter. I was already following you. For those that want to follow him, it's Ron Snyder Media, SNYDER. And I guess the best place to get your book is Amazon?
Amazon, McFarland Publishing. It went to press today. It should be it's available for pre-order. And we should have them out for hard copy and Kindle before too long. And hopefully, with everything going on, they'll be able to get delivered fairly quickly.
Well, I sniff an opportunity. You are talking to the heartland of the CFL right now, and I could see if there was to be a book signing in Saskatchewan. Darren, you're the promoter of all time. We'll get him up there one of our tailgate parties.
At the tailgate party.
Ron, keep in touch, and congrats on the book. I know it's a great feeling, and we will talk down the road.
Thank you so much, and good luck to you guys, and stay safe through all of this.
Same to you. Thank you. Ron Snyder checking in from Baltimore wrote the book on the Stallions.
Yep.
And here's the thing. You were born, I always forget, was it 88? 87?
Yeah.
Do you remember much of that?
That's my one memory of watching the CFL as a kid. And I remember I loved Danny McManus as a quarterback, and my dad would be watching the games, and me and my brother would watch about a quarter, maybe half. By the time they hit halftime, we went and grabbed our hockey shoulder pads and went out in the backyard and played football for the rest of the game, right? You can't sit down and watch for that long. When you're a kid, you want to play. So we did that, and I was Danny McManus, or you were Doug Flutie or whatever. And, Darren Flutie was the guy there, and my name's Darren, so you attach there to that kind of situation. But the earliest memory I really have is that 95 Grey Cup. My parents had people over, all the snacks, they had the party, we watched it, and somewhere at my parents' house, we've got that 1995 Huddle Up in Saskatchewan.
Oh, yeah.
We have that on a VHS tape, that game, recorded on the VHS, Baltimore beating Calgary. Wow. So I remember that game.
Okay.
I do.
That was a stud team, too.
Well, so many.
Both of them.
It's not just about the Stallions, of course. And look, we're going to break, and we can come back with some of these stories. But, for years, I've worked very closely with the PR people of the league, and they've always wanted to cover up the U.S. expansion like a turd in the sandbox. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to talk about Rod. Stop talking about it. And Ed Willis, my good friend from the Vancouver province, Ed Willis, who is a spit disturber if there ever was one, wrote a book on this.
Yes, he did.
Border Wars.
Yes, he did.
And he shipped me a copy of it. He signed it to Rod from one CFL guy to another. And I read that sucker. Actually, as we were flying to Tampa, I read the whole thing. You were with me.
Yes.
And I bust out. I was crying. I was laughing so hard at some of the stories in this book. When they announced the team in Las Vegas, they had strippers and midgets and unicorns at the news conference. Well, that's my kind of thing. But they're like, the more they look, we'll take a break and come back. But when I finished the book, I was like, oh, I kind of see why they want to forget this. But because it was somewhat embarrassing.
Great storytelling, though.
Great storytelling.
Yes.
It's the history of the league. See,
and there were some stud players that came out of that.
Well, sometimes
Archer.
People have a history, a family history. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to talk about it. Well, you know what? That's not the way to deal with it. Not talking about it. Sorry. But anyways, when I keep wanting to talk about it and they don't, that's where I realize it's better that I'm over here doing this show and they're over there.
Yep.
And we'll just talk about what we want to talk about and they can talk what they want to talk about. Yeah. We'll be back. It's the Rod Pedersen Show, Facebook Live, coming to Game Plus Network in April, and listen live at rodpedersen.com.
You're watching Rod Pedersen On Demand. For more of the Rod Pedersen Show, visit rodpedersen.com or follow Rod Pedersen on social media.